Hey guys, welcome back to The Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People's Story. HOA Karen Pepper sprayed my veteran dad saying his mobility scooter was a deadly weapon. I taught them a lesson and came out on top. I never thought I'd be writing one of these stories, but here we are. This happened over the course of about 3 months, and I'm still in disbelief about how quickly things spiraled out of control. Some background. I moved into a nice suburban neighborhood about 2 years ago. The houses aren't McMansions, but they're decent sized with small yards. The kind of place where kids ride bikes and people walk their dogs. Perfect for me since I work from home and wanted somewhere quiet but not isolated. The only downside was the HOA, but I figured I could live with it since the fees were reasonable and the rules didn't seem overly restrictive. For the first year and a half, things were great. I kept my lawn mowed, didn't paint my house neon green, and generally minded my own business. I even went to a few HOA meetings, though they were mind-numbingly boring. The board consisted of 5 people, most of whom seemed reasonable enough, except for Karen. Karen was elected to the board about 6 months ago. She was in her late 50s with that signature highlighted bob haircut and an expression like she was perpetually smelling something unpleasant. From day one, she made it clear that she saw herself as the neighborhood's personal enforcer. Within weeks of her election, violation notices started appearing on doors for the most trivial things. Garbage cans left out an hour too long, a garden hose not properly coiled, you name it. But we all mostly just rolled our eyes and complied. That changed when my dad came to visit. My dad served in the Army for 35 years before retiring. He did 3 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. A few years ago, he took some shrapnel to his legs during his final deployment. He can walk short distances with a cane, but for anything longer, he uses a mobility scooter. He's still adjusting to this new normal, and it's been hard on him. He was always so active, and now simple things like grocery shopping can be exhausting. He came to stay with me for 2 weeks to help me renovate my bathroom. Dad might not be able to stand for long periods, but he's still great with his hands and has forgotten more about plumbing than I'll ever know. Plus, I think he needed to feel useful. The first few days went fine. We'd work on the bathroom in the morning, and then Dad would take his scooter around the neighborhood in the afternoon while I caught up on work. He'd always been a social guy, and he made friends with several of the neighbors. One older gentleman, a Vietnam vet, would sit on his porch with Dad and swap war stories. On day 5, I was in a Zoom meeting when I heard shouting from outside. I excused myself and went to check it out. There was Dad on his scooter at the end of my driveway, and standing over him was Karen, red-faced and gesturing wildly. I hurried over. "What's going on?" Karen turned to me, nostrils flaring. "Are you responsible for this man? He almost ran me over with that contraption." Dad looked bewildered. I was going maybe 3 miles an hour on the sidewalk. I saw her coming and moved over to give her space. Karen wasn't having it. "These motorized vehicles are not permitted on the sidewalks in this community. They're a safety hazard." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "First of all, this is my father, and he's a disabled veteran. His mobility scooter is medical equipment, not a recreational vehicle. Second, there's absolutely nothing in the HOA bylaws prohibiting mobility aids." "I know the rules," she snapped, "and I know I don't feel safe with him zipping around endangering people. If he can't walk, he shouldn't be out unsupervised." I could see Dad's face darken. Being treated like he was incompetent was a sore spot. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I served this country for 35 years. I think I can manage to drive a scooter without killing anyone." Karen sniffed. "Well, I'll be bringing this up at the next board meeting. In the meantime, keep that thing off the sidewalks." She stalked off. I apologized to Dad, who brushed it off. "Don't worry about it, son. I've dealt with worse than suburban dictators." I should have known it wouldn't end there. 2 days later, Dad was coming back from his chat with the Vietnam vet when Karen stepped directly into his path from between 2 parked cars. "I told you to keep that thing off the sidewalks," she shouted. Dad tried to maneuver around her. "Ma'am, please step aside." Instead, Karen pulled something from her purse. Before Dad could react, she had pepper sprayed him directly in the face. Dad, blinded and in agony, accidentally drove his scooter into a mailbox post. The scooter tipped and he fell to the sidewalk. Karen was screaming that he had tried to run her over, that she was defending herself from assault with a deadly weapon. I was working in the front yard and heard the commotion. I sprinted over to find my father on the ground, face red and swollen, struggling to breathe, while Karen stood over him yelling about calling the police. I wasn't thinking straight. My father, a decorated veteran who had survived multiple combat zones, was lying on the ground because some power-tripping HOA board member had assaulted him. I knelt beside him, trying to help him up while shouting at Karen to back off. By this time, several neighbors had come out to see what was happening. Karen was in full performance mode, clutching her knee and claiming Dad had deliberately tried to run her down. "He came straight at me," she cried. "If I hadn't defended myself, he could have killed me with that weapon." Dad was still gasping for air, his eyes swollen shut. I needed to get him inside and rinse his eyes, but I was terrified to leave Karen spinning her narrative. Thankfully, one neighbor, a nurse, came over to help Dad while I called 911. Another neighbor who had witnessed the whole thing was already arguing with Karen. "That's not what happened, and you know it," he said firmly. "I saw the whole thing from my window. You stepped in front of him deliberately and sprayed him for no reason." Karen's eyes bulged. "Are you calling me a liar? He was breaking the rules. These sidewalks aren't meant for motorized vehicles." By now, I had 911 on the phone requesting both police and an ambulance. While I was talking to the dispatcher, I noticed multiple neighbors had their phones out, recording Karen's meltdown. The next hour was a blur. The ambulance arrived first, and the paramedics began treating Dad. His eyes needed to be thoroughly flushed, and they were concerned about his breathing, especially given his age. They loaded him into the ambulance, and I was about to go with him when the police finally showed up. 2 officers got out and immediately separated everyone. One took Karen aside while the other spoke with me and the witnesses. Karen was still performing, now limping dramatically and pointing at the scooter as if it were a tank. I did my best to calmly explain what had happened, and several neighbors backed up my account. Then something unexpected happened. One of them, a quiet guy who lived across the street and whom I'd barely spoken to, stepped forward. "I have a security camera that covers this section of the sidewalk," he said, holding up his phone. "I pulled up the footage. It shows everything." The officer watched the video, his expression darkening. He then went to confer with his partner. After a brief discussion, they approached Karen. I couldn't hear what was said, but Karen's face went from righteous indignation to shock. The officers then came back to me. "Sir, we're placing her under arrest for assault," one said. "Would you like to press charges? Is water wet?" "Absolutely," I replied. "You'll need to come to the station to give a statement, but first you should go to the hospital to be with your father." I nodded gratefully and headed to the hospital while the officers handcuffed a now hysterical Karen and put her in the back of their cruiser. At the hospital, Dad was doing better. The pepper spray had been painful but hadn't caused any permanent damage. They were keeping him overnight for observation due to his age and some respiratory concerns, but he was expected to recover fully. "Son," he said, his voice raspy, "don't let this consume you. Some people just can't handle even a little bit of power without going nuts." Classic Dad, always keeping perspective. But I wasn't feeling so philosophical. This woman had assaulted my disabled father, a man who had given decades of his life in service to his country because she thought his medical device was breaking some imaginary rule. The next day, after getting Dad settled back at my place, I went to the police station to give my statement. While there, I learned that Karen had been released on bail but was facing assault charges. The officer mentioned that Karen was claiming self-defense, insisting that Dad had tried to run her over with his dangerous motorized vehicle. "The video evidence contradicts her statement," the officer said. "It clearly shows her stepping into his path and immediately spraying him without provocation." I thanked him for the information. On my way out, I ran into the neighbor with the security camera. He was there giving his statement and copies of the video. "I've had issues with her before," he told me. "She's been harassing everyone about minor infractions since she got on the board. I installed the cameras after she kept leaving violation notices on my door for garbage cans being half an inch out of designated placement area." We exchanged numbers and he promised to send me a copy of the video footage. When I got home, I found 3 separate neighbors had also sent me videos they'd taken of the aftermath. Karen's performance was recorded from multiple angles, as was her contradictory statements to the police. But the real surprise came that evening in the form of an email from the HOA board. They were holding an emergency meeting the next day to discuss the unfortunate incident. They requested my presence, as well as any witnesses willing to speak. The tone of the email was neutral, but I got the sense they were doing damage control. I forwarded the email to my neighbor with the security footage, and he agreed to come with me. 2 other witnesses also said they'd attend. The meeting was held in the community center. 4 board members sat at a table at the front, with a conspicuously empty chair where Karen would normally sit. About 30 residents filled the audience seats. The board president, a retired accountant named Harold, called the meeting to order. "We're here to discuss yesterday's incident involving one of our board members," he began. "We want to gather all the facts before determining a course of action. I was called up first to give my account. I stuck to the facts, describing what I had seen and what Dad had told me. When I mentioned that multiple neighbors had video evidence, there was an audible murmur in the room. Over the next hour, 3 witnesses gave their accounts, all consistent with mine. The neighbor with the security footage played it for the room. The video was crystal clear. Karen deliberately stepping into Dad's path, Dad attempting to stop, and Karen immediately pepper spraying him in the face. There were gasps when Dad fell off the scooter. The board members looked increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, Harold cleared his throat. "This is very concerning footage," he said. "Are there any other perspectives we should consider?" A woman in the back raised her hand. "Yes, I'd like to share something. I've been on the receiving end of Karen's harassment for months. She left notices on my door every day for a week because my garden gnome was unapproved lawn ornamentation. When I pointed out that the bylaws don't mention garden gnomes, she issued me a fine anyway." Another resident stood up. "She threatened to have my car towed because it was parked too close to the curb. There's nothing in the bylaws about that either." Suddenly, it was like a dam had broken. Resident after resident stood to share their Karen horror stories. Some were minor annoyances, but others were downright disturbing, like the elderly woman who had been reduced to tears when Karen berated her for hanging wind chimes. Noise pollution. Harold and the other board members looked shell-shocked. Finally, Harold held up his hands for quiet. "We were not aware of the extent of these issues," he said carefully. "Given the seriousness of the assault and the pattern of behavior described, I'm calling for an immediate vote to remove Karen from the board. All in favor?" The other 3 board members raised their hands without hesitation. "Additionally," Harold continued, "I move that the HOA formally apologize to—" He looked at me. "My father," I supplied. "To your father, and cover any medical expenses not covered by insurance. All in favor?" Again, 3 hands went up. I was a bit stunned. I had expected to walk into a whitewashing, not actual accountability. But the video evidence combined with the community testimony had made Karen's behavior indefensible. As the meeting wrapped up, Harold approached me. "I want to personally apologize for what happened to your father. This is not what our HOA is about. We're here to maintain property values and community standards, not terrorize residents. I hope you'll allow us to make this right." I appreciated his sincerity, but made it clear that while I accepted the HOA's apology, I would still be pursuing criminal charges against Karen. He nodded in understanding. Over the next week, 2 things happened. First, Dad started to recover, though he was understandably anxious about using his scooter in the neighborhood again. Second, I received a letter from Karen's attorney, offering to settle if I would drop the charges. The letter suggested that Dad had been partially at fault, and that Karen had reasonably feared for her safety. I laughed out loud and then forwarded the letter to the lawyer I'd retained. He advised me not to respond. A few days later, we learned that the district attorney was pursuing the case as a hate crime against a disabled person, which carried much heavier penalties. Apparently, Karen's history of making disparaging comments about those people, referring to residents with disabilities, had come back to haunt her. Several residents had come forward with accounts of her targeting those with visible disabilities, claiming they lowered property values. Dad's 2-week visit stretched into 3 as we waited for the preliminary hearing. He was healing well, but still dealing with some respiratory issues from the pepper spray. The day before the hearing, Karen's lawyer reached out again, this time with a much different tone. Karen was willing to plead guilty to a lesser charge of simple assault if we would agree not to pursue civil damages. After consulting with both my lawyer and Dad, we decided to accept the plea deal on one condition. Karen would have to make a public apology at the next HOA meeting and resign from any community leadership positions for at least 5 years. Her lawyer balked at this initially, but when our lawyer pointed out the strength of our case and the potential for significant civil damages, Karen eventually agreed. The next HOA meeting was standing room only. Word had gotten around that Karen would be making a statement. She hadn't been seen in the neighborhood since her arrest, so her appearance caused a stir. She looked smaller somehow, her signature haircut deflated, her expression subdued. She took the microphone and read from a prepared statement. "I want to apologize to—" She glanced at Dad, who was sitting beside me, now able to attend without his scooter, though he had his cane. "To this gentleman for my actions on May 15th. My behavior was inexcusable and reflected poor judgment. I acknowledge that mobility aids are protected under the law and essential for those who need them. I am resigning from the HOA board effective immediately and will not seek any leadership positions in this community for the foreseeable future." It wasn't the most heartfelt apology I've ever heard, but Dad nodded acceptance. As Karen walked out, a couple of residents actually applauded, not in support of her, but in celebration of her departure. In the weeks that followed, the HOA underwent some significant changes. Harold, the board president, initiated a review of all the bylaws with the aim of making them clearer and more reasonable. He established a grievance committee to handle complaints about selective enforcement, and most importantly, he worked with a consultant to ensure the HOA was fully compliant with the Americans with Disabilities Act. As for Dad, he finished helping me with the bathroom renovation before returning home. His last day in the neighborhood, he took his scooter out for a final ride and was met with waves and greetings from neighbors who had heard his story. The Vietnam vet even organized a small send-off with a few other local veterans. Dad being Dad, he took the whole experience in stride. "You know," he told me as we watched the sunset from my front porch, "I've seen the worst of people in war zones, but also the best. What I saw in this neighborhood after everything happened, that was the best. People standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable." I couldn't argue with that. What started as a nightmare had turned into something positive. The HOA was implementing actual reforms. Karen was facing consequences for her actions, and the community had come together in a way I hadn't seen before. As for me, I'm still living in the same house, and I even volunteered for the HOA's new community outreach committee. We're planning a neighborhood accessibility project to improve sidewalks and curb cuts. Dad says he might come back to help with that too. Sometimes it takes a crisis to reveal the true character of a community. In our case, when pushed to choose between enabling a bully and standing up for what's right, my neighbors chose the latter, and that makes me proud to call this place home. Edit, thanks for all the supportive comments. To answer some common questions, 1. Dad is doing much better now, though he occasionally has some respiratory issues that his doctor is monitoring. 2. Karen did complete her community service as part of her plea deal. I've seen her once or twice in the grocery store, but she avoids eye contact. 3. Yes, we did pursue some civil damages to cover Dad's medical bills. The HOA's insurance ended up covering it since Karen was acting in her capacity as a board member when the incident occurred. The insurance company is reportedly considering dropping the HOA unless they implement the reforms they promised. 4. The Vietnam vet and Dad are still in touch. They talk weekly on Zoom. 5. For those asking about legal consequences, Karen received 18 months probation, 200 hours of community service, and was required to take an anger management course. The judge made it very clear that if not for her clean prior record, she would have been looking at jail time. The next one is a pro-revenge story. This one might be petty and definitely not as epic as some of the posts I've seen here. And I'm long-winded. Relevant background info first. Anyway, several years ago, I was working at one of the big hardware stores in my area. It's a household name and had some upward mobility with decent pay for the area. I never really found a niche there after my first year and a half. I learned quickly though, so they kind of made me a Swiss Army employee. I could work hardware, plumbing, mix paint, make keys, prepare contracts for installs, and knew all the features and flaws of the appliance models we sold. I was happy to do this because I was building a reputation as someone who could do everything. 2 years in, a new program was implemented that I was uniquely qualified to assist with. They created a new position for me. It was marketed as an all-in-one renovation remodel service for interiors. I was to assist the designer with product selection, product information, contracts, and local marketing for this service. Everyone involved was super excited about it. Note, I was still only making $10 an hour in 2015 for this. The problem was that because this was brand new, no one knew how it should work. The designer basically had to figure it out for herself while I tried to catch her up with all of the store and product knowledge I had accumulated during my unique experience with the company. Issues with the program. It was way too expensive. Product to be used had to come from one of our stores, which was limiting. No one knew about it. It was a rocky start. Coworkers would call me over to talk to customers if they mentioned working on a big project, but that's all we had. No completed jobs to reference or anything provided by corporate to get us running. We made our own stuff. I put together a video advertising the service and got the nod from management to use company card to purchase a TV and media player to roll the video on repeat. We built vignettes in the store to showcase our design ability. I had been picking up a lot from the designer, so it ended up being a partnership in effect. The Micromanager. Enter Devin, the assistant manager. He had actually been involved in the project from the beginning and had been pretty supportive and brought good energy at first, but I think he got fed up with issues that we couldn't control. Sloppy contactors refusing to fix things that they messed up, slow design process as customers worked out what they wanted, and people just backing out after taking a bunch of our time when they see the price. We were, on average, charging $3,000 more for a small bathroom remodel on labor alone. Consulting and design fees were also worked into the final cost. The product was discounted to basically being tax-free, but as I mentioned, options were limited to products the company sold. It was just too expensive to make many sales on the poorer side of town, where almost everyone knows some kind of contractor or tradesman with connections. It wasn't a good market for this program, but we did manage to start hitting and exceeding our numbers. #7 in the region for the brand new program was not bad, and just when we finally started getting some business and a rhythm around 8 months in, Devin decided that it was not working fast enough for him. Obviously, the designer was to blame since he had no authority over the contractors or setting prices. She didn't know what she was doing and he was going to make some changes. He honestly didn't do much besides hover, bring bad energy, and make terrible suggestions. He didn't understand the scope of what we had to do to get a customer out the door and happy. He forced us to cut corners and get the sale as quickly as possible without concern for liability, for basically destroying a room in someone's home to remake it, or what was realistic in terms of timelines. Customers felt rushed and got nervous. They backed out. We came to a standstill. We would only have 2 or 3 designs in progress at a time, but suddenly after working our asses off building the program, we had no customers for the first time in 6 months. Obviously, Devin was not subjecting us to his authority hard enough, so he went harder and fired the designer. I lost my patience. Justice, or injustice, I don't know. I'm a chill dude, but I had been working my ass off for this company, making peanuts on the promise that I was working towards something. I endured working for the incompetent managers that got their positions because they started working there at 18 and made it their life. The toxic alpha male, I will lead, you will follow BS was too much. So I started bullying him back, making fun of him in a teasing way where he couldn't really react without looking bad or losing control. I did that for a while, and he left me alone to run the program in the interim since I was the only option. The designer and I had become friends though, so I was still mad about how it went down. I wasn't finished yet, but I didn't know what to do. Eventually, they got another designer, and Devin had me moved back to what I had been doing before. Passed over for several promotions that I was more than qualified for. The market had been flooded with long-time employees that were being moved around. Bad luck, but I was done with the place. One day, we were sent an email link to an anonymous manager review survey. The store computers were set up with an always-on and logged-in user profile, so I wrote down the link and verified with a coworker that they weren't unique. In every department I visited that day, I wrote a review for Devin. All different ratings, some good, some bad, but I made the good ones so that they sounded bad, but as if I didn't know it was bad. I did that maybe 10 times. It wasn't character assassination or anything, just opinion-based stuff with some vague examples, so no one could figure out it was me. I didn't lie either. I just said what people don't usually say out loud. He would barely look at anyone after that. A couple of weeks later, he resigned his position as assistant manager and took an exterior design position at the other end of the store, as far away from the departments he had been over before. Basically the same thing as what we had done with interiors, but he was in the designer's shoes. I left a couple of months later to work tech support for DHS, but while I was still in training for that, my friends from the store told me he had gotten fired. Maybe he learned something? He should at least have learned how my designer friend felt. They were both fired at Christmas. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could like the video and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. We'll see you again tomorrow.